Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to be talking about a building that Mark Twain once called the ugliest building in America. Another person called it an architectural infant asylum, and yet another person referred to it as the greatest monstrosity in America. And we're talking, if you hadn't guessed, about the Eisenhower Executive Office Building in Washington, D.C., which is right off the west wing of the White House. And Chris, when you look at this building, I can understand Twain's sentiment. It doesn't match the rest of DC. It is this huge, in my opinion, eyesore where it is. If it was in a different location, I think it would be quite nice. But where it is, it just doesn't fit.
I think that all comes back to location, 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 because if you were to look at the Biltmore House
Yeah.
and you put it in the same category here as the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, if it's somewhere like in Asheville, North Carolina, it's beautiful. It's
Mhm.
absolutely gorgeous. I mean, I'm surprised of Twain saying that, but I do understand it if you look at it location wise, because it does not match what is surrounding. Because most of the other style was done in like a Greco-Roman kind of a style, and this is more of that flamboyant French style that you see. So one of the things that does happen with architecture is if you put different types of architecture in the same area, it looks off. It doesn't match up as it should. So I get it. However, while it might be, I think you also said an asylum.
Yeah, an infant asylum.
Well,
As I
it
said,
very appropriate since this asylum is where all basically work of the executive branch of our government seems to exist. Everything just about except for the president, vice president, his inner staff, that's where the rest of the work takes place is in the what they call the EEOB type building.
yeah, and I think you mentioned the executive office of the president. I think a lot of Americans don't understand how big that office actually is. And I'm not talking about the physical office. I'm talking about the number of people in what's called the executive office of the president. I mean, you're not talking about, 50 people or 100 people or 500 people. There are literally thousands of people who work in the executive office of the president. So when you have the president of the United States, he or she is supported by a very large group of people, as you said just a minute ago, Chris, most of whom work in the Eisenhower building. In fact, presidents have spent time working in the Eisenhower building, as I'm sure we'll talk about. Vice presidents spend time working in there, and a lot of very important events have happened in this building. So, though it might not be Mark Twain's favorite building and a few others' favorite building, it is a building that has a very important history in Washington, D.C., and therefore to the United States. And Chris, this whole thing, this idea, the origin of the Eisenhower office building predates Eisenhower by what, 100 years?
Yeah, and one of the things that goes along with this, you were talking about the executive branch being the largest, and this building was originally constructed to serve as the state war and navy building, and so the executive branch houses all of a lot of different branches of government per se with the executive branch, but one of those things is the armed forces, and the military. So if you add up all of the people that work for the executive branch, you're looking at over 4 million Americans.
Yeah.
I mean, it's huge. And this building houses so many people, but it is a building that took from 1871 to 1888 to build. And in a way, if you look at it the way Twain looks at it, it looks like it was being built, add a little bit here, and now we're going to keep adding, because the staffs of the State Department and the State Department basically dealing with domestic affairs, things here in the United States. You had the War Department, which was dealing with things of war, Army. And then you had the Navy Department. So as America grows in international stature, international form, You have to have more staff to be able to take care. I'm sorry, I had to sneeze there. I'm sorry, but it took a lot of people to man all of those different departments, and so it's flamboyant, it's extravagant, it's exuberant, but it is also a very important building because some of America's most historic events have had their origins from this building.
Yeah. And I mentioned earlier that it's right near the West Wing and, easy access from the Eisenhower building to the White House to the West Wing, thus to the president himself. Let's go back now to December 1869. This is when the Eisenhower Executive Office Building, of course, it wasn't, Eisenhower had never been heard of at this particular point. But this is when this building sort of starts its life. In 1869, there, the end of 1869, Congress appoints a commission. And that's one thing Congress is really good at, Chris, is appointing commissions and committees and groups to investigate stuff and to do things. But they appointed a commission to select a site and start working on plans and estimates and all this for a new building for the State Department. And it was also going to include, like you mentioned, war and Navy and other buildings. So this is when it all sort of started there in 1869. And you mentioned a little earlier that it's going to use that sort of French design. It's not going to be the typical, I guess you called it Greco-Roman style building that you see like in the White House and the Capitol and all that. Instead, it's going to be using that French design. And as you mentioned earlier, it's going to take 17 years to build that huge building. And I just sat here and think, there's a bridge down the road here that blew out during Hurricane Florence, and they're still working on it. So if that bridge, if they keep working on that bridge, it might take them just as long to replace that bridge as it did to build the executive office building.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things that you have to think about is why did they choose the French style? I mean, because you have the Treasury building, you have the White House, you have the Capitol, as you mentioned. They're all done in a particular way. And this kind of goes back to this the bidder, the architect, the one who has the best bid or the one who has the best friends, gets the deal. We've talked about this in previous episodes on other buildings and monuments and statues and things of that nature. That at the end of the day, if your design wins, your design wins. And so this individual, Alfred Mullet, is selected with his design and construction begins. But one of the other things is that they're considering is as they're building this building, they decide that they want to use cast iron. They want to use plaster. The one thing they do not want to use in this building is wood. And we look at the building of buildings and houses today and we see stick-built homes. But because of the War of 1812 and because of the British coming into Washington, D.C. and burning parts of the White House and other buildings in Washington, everything caught on fire because of the wood. And so they didn't want to have a repeat of that. And so they put all of this cast iron, this plaster, and they use this type of material to prevent there from being a massive destruction of it. And so when you use cast iron and plaster, then that changes how you're going to do staircases. Well, we need granite, and then we're going to use cast bronze and all of this other stuff. Well, right, not only is it big, is it expensive, but that's where that gaudiness can come into also. You have all of these different types of material that's being used, doesn't make it that attractive.
Yeah, not attractive where it is. I'm looking at some of the particulars of the building, Chris. It has, or had originally, I don't know if it still does, 4,004 bronze staircases. Stair banisters, excuse me, not staircases, stair banisters. It's got 65 stairs, 1,784 steps. It originally had 151 fireplaces. Its original cost, or the cost of the building all told, was 10 billion $38, $482.42. I can't afford that.
I know. And what starts to happen is this building is built and people move in, and it's all of a sudden the State Department decides they want their own building. The War Department wants a building. And so everybody starts to leave, and you start to have this large vacant building right next to the White House. White House is starting to grow with staff and things of that nature. And so, finally, what begins to happen is the White House basically takes over this building. And then it starts to hold the people who oversee the White House. It takes the National Security Council. You have the Office of Management and Budget, and the Office of the Vice President. So all of these things start to merge into this particular building. And as you mentioned, it allows the president and other members to use this building for receptions or for news conferences or treaties or things of that nature. And so it is a national historic landmark because it is using its location to be able to meet the needs of American citizens.
Yeah, and I said a minute ago 10 billion. It's actually $10 million. I misread my
But
it's still a lot of money. For me, Chris, once you pass a million, it doesn't matter anymore. Does
yeah,
I'm not good at that. Yeah. But you mentioned that. Yeah, 1949 was the year that it was officially turned over to the White House. As you said, everybody else has sort of moved out. It's turned over to the White House, and the executive branch now controls it. And you had mentioned off air, I don't know if you mentioned on air, but it's basically where all the action takes place. People think the action is the White House, but the White House, second floor, third floor, however you want to count it, that's the residence, the first floor, and then I guess the ground level floor. I guess there are a lot of staterooms in there and things like that. But when you talk about the actual offices that the staff man, that where the action takes place, so to speak, a lot of this is happening in the executive office building. And I want to say, before it was turned over in 1949, there were presidents who had connections to the office building. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about that. Presidents: Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, Dwight Eisenhower, Lyndon Johnson, Gerald Ford, George H.W. Bush, all had offices for one reason or another in the executive office building before they were president, before they became president of the United States. It has housed throughout its history 16 secretaries of the Navy, 21 secretaries of war, 24 secretaries of state. Winston Churchill, in our last episode, we talked about the Blair House. Winston Churchill stayed there. Winston Churchill worked in this building, not as an employee, but of course as a visitor. President Herbert Hoover used the office in the building for a few months after the 1929 Christmas Eve fire in the West Wing of the White House. So this building is just absolutely, Chris, and we've already said it, but it is chock-a-block full of presidential history, executive history, and it's where, as you said, the action takes place. If you want to know what's going on, the Eisenhower Executive Office Building is the place to go, because that's where the action is. And Chris, I would like to point out to our listeners that it actually originally had wings, and I guess it still does physically anyway. But you had a wing, for example, that belonged to the State Department, a wing that belonged to the War Department, a wing that belonged to the Navy Department. And so it is a huge building, 5 stories high, and it is sort of it's sort of in many ways the heart of the executive.
yeah, and to the point where even presidents have designated office space over there. There's of course
Yeah.
treaties and receptions, but Herbert Hoover worked out of the executive office building because there was a fire
Yeah.
in the Oval Office in 1929. Dwight D. Eisenhower had a presidential news conference in what's known as the Indian Treaty Room. One of the interesting things about the Indian Treaty Room of the Eisenhower Building is it's the most expensive room in the entire building. And that is because everything is made out, all the walls are made out of solid marble. Absolutely beautiful. That's there. Nixon had a hideaway office. He needed to get away, and that's one of the places where he would go to get away. And you also see that the vice president has an office there.
Yeah.
Their vice president really doesn't have an office in the West Wing or in the White House. That's the president's house. So, when the vice president goes to work at an office away from their home, they go to the Eisenhower building. And I think that it's very interesting to note that it hasn't always been called the Eisenhower Executive Office Building. It was just recently named that with President Bill Clinton, who decided to name it that. So it has a lot of history, yet I think you have this asylum, this grotesque building, and yet, Ray, I promise probably 75% of all people who go to tour the White House and that area around Washington, D.C., have walked by this building and have no idea of its magnitude when it comes to political affairs.
Yeah, and you know what? They probably look at it and think, what in the world is that monstrosity doing there?
Right.
I'm sure in a perfect world, the executive government would like it to be a little less obvious, maybe a little more discreet, maybe a little bit more blended into the surroundings than it is. I'm looking at a picture of it now, Chris, and I think we've already said, you know, if you had put it in the mountains, if you had put it, in the woods, it would be an absolutely wonderful, put it on on some European plains with large fields around it, and it would be absolutely wonderful. But where it is, it just doesn't fit. I'm looking at a picture. The White House is off to the left. I see the Washington Monument behind it, and it just doesn't fit where it is. But it doesn't matter what it looks like. It doesn't matter what Mark Twain thought about it. It actually does its job. And Chris, one could say, Chris, that it might just look like a haunted house.
Yeah, I was going to ask, Shirley, if this, and by the way, this building, if you walked corridor to corridor, that says you can walk 1.73 miles if you walk through the Eisenhower building. So almost 2 miles is how big this building is.
Yeah.
Ray, I'm sure there's got to be some aspect of ghost in the Eisenhower Executive Office Building.
There is. Multiple people have died in the building. The way I count it, it's around a dozen, maybe a little more people have died in the executive office building. There has been reports of ghosts being sighted in the building itself. Some people have talked about it having just a bad vibe to it, a bad energy to it that's very ominous on the inside. And one thing I did not know, Chris, and I don't know if the hauntings are connected to this, but the architect Alfred Mullet committed suicide. I don't know if it was there in the building, but his life ended in a very tragic way. But there is plenty of examples of people who have died in the building, and there has been plenty of sightings of ghostly appearances and things like that in the executive office building. So apparently it's not just the staff of the president that works in that building, maybe some former residents of DC also work in the building. Before we go, and we're sort of out of time here, but before we go, Chris, correct me if I'm wrong. The vice president lives in the Naval Conservatory. So the vice president lives in the Naval Conservatory and works in the Eisenhower Executive Office Building. The
Correct.
president lives and works in the White House. So
Right. Vice president has to commute to work.
yeah, the president just takes some stairs and walks down a hall.
Pretty sure there's got to be an elevator today.
Yeah, there probably is, but I'm trying to think on the White House. Is the president has to go outside to get to the Oval Office, don't they? Don't they have to
Yes,
on
they have to.
the
Yes,
portico to get
that's
to the
you
Oval
leave
Office?
out of the portico to get to the main residence. White
Because
House is kind of separated.
yeah,
The West Wing, excuse me, is separated. So they kind of have to walk down that
yeah,
portico.
because
get from point A to point B.
inside the building originally was a swimming pool. There's an office area and a swimming pool. And now that's the media room, but I don't know that there's a way around that room. You have to go outside. So yeah.
But even when you go outside, you're still invisible.
Yeah. Yeah. Security makes sure of that. Well, Chris, this has been a great episode. Another fascinating look at a building that has such importance to America and has such a great history. We hope that you have enjoyed this episode, that you will share it with your family and friends. Leave us a comment, leave us a like on Spotify. Until next time, I'm Ray.
I'm Chris.
We'll talk to you later.